The entire township of Millhaven, Ontario thought Calvin Dempster had lost his mind the same autumn he refused to let his father-in-law sell the orchard. The bank had already drawn up the paperwork. The apple trees hadn't produced a decent crop in 4 years, and the 53-year-old former mill worker had just spent the last of his savings replanting half the property with something nobody in Grey County had grown commercially in over a century. People shook their heads when the old varieties came in, crooked and small. People whispered when he let the grass grow knee-high between the rows. People laughed outright when he said the orchard would outlast every one of theirs. Then the provincial agricultural inspector arrived one September morning, and the laughter stopped. A cold wind moved through the Niagara escarpment the October that Calvin Dempster's life changed direction. The hardwoods along the ridge had already turned, maple going red, birch going yellow. And the sky above Millhaven carried that particular shade of gray that Grey County residents knew meant the growing season was finished whether the calendar agreed or not. Calvin Dempster was 53 years old. He stood 5 feet 11, broad through the shoulders, in a way that came from 30 years of physical work rather than any particular effort at the gym. His hair had gone almost entirely white in his mid-40s, cropped short and practical. His face was square-jawed with deep lines around the eyes and mouth that people who didn't know him sometimes mistook for hardness. Those who knew him understood the lines came from squinting into the sun across open land, from years of quiet concentration, from the particular kind of patience that belonged to men who watched things grow. He had large hands, the knuckles permanently stained with engine oil and soil, and he moved slowly and deliberately in the way of a man who had learned that rushing things rarely changed their outcome. Calvin had grown up in Hanover, 30 kilometers east, the son of a machinist who kept a kitchen garden and knew the names of every plant in it. He had married Diane Whitmore at 26. They had spent the first decade of their marriage in Owen Sound, where Calvin worked the floor of a pulp mill, and then the mill closed, and they moved to the small house on the edge of her father's property, outside Millhaven, because there was nowhere else to go, and because Diane's father, Russell Whitmore, was getting old and needed someone close. Russell Whitmore was 78 years old that October, and the orchard he had tended for most of his adult life was failing. The Whitmore property covered 60 acres along a gentle southwest-facing slope above the Sydenham River. For 40 years it had been one of the better apple operations in the county, not large by any measure, but consistent. Russell had grown 7 varieties. He knew when to spray and when to hold back. He had a gift for reading weather that the younger generation called lucky, and the older generation understood was simply attention. But Russell's wife had passed 3 years earlier, and since then his attention had frayed. He forgot to record rainfall. He missed signs of fire blight until it had spread through the older blocks. He hired the wrong people, and then let them go too late. By the time Calvin and Diane moved into the small house at the end of the lane, the orchard had already begun its slow retreat from viability. Calvin noticed this within his first season. He said nothing about it. He helped where he could, mowing, fixing equipment, hauling brush, and he watched. The October evening that changed everything, Calvin sat at the kitchen table going over what passed for the orchard's accounts. Russell had given him access to the books without asking why, which told Calvin more than the numbers did. Diane was washing dishes at the sink, and through the window the last light was leaving the ridge. Calvin set the papers down and looked at them for a long time. The orchard had lost money in each of the past 4 years. The losses weren't catastrophic each season, but compounded over time they had eaten through whatever savings Russell had put away. There was a line of credit at the Meaford branch of the bank that had been extended twice. The interest alone was consuming what little the orchard still produced. Calvin did the arithmetic 3 times. The result was the same each time. When Diane came to the table, he showed her. She sat down and looked at the numbers without speaking. Then she looked at her husband. "Dad's been talking to someone," she said. Calvin waited. "A buyer. A development company out of Barrie. They want the slope for a subdivision, 48 units." She paused. "He hasn't signed anything yet." Calvin looked out the window toward the dark shapes of the apple rows against the night sky. "He's going to," Diane said quietly. "He thinks there's no other way." Calvin said nothing for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a night wind moved through the tree rows with a sound like slow breathing. "There might be another way," he finally said. Diane looked at him. "Give me one growing season," he said, "before he signs anything." She studied her husband's face the way she had learned to, over 27 years of marriage, looking for the difference between wishful thinking and the particular stillness that came over him when he was certain of something. She had seen that stillness before. She had learned to trust it. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to put heritage varieties back into this ground." Diane did not laugh, but later that night, lying awake in the small house, she wondered whether her husband was asking the orchard to do something it no longer had the capacity to do. The news moved through Millhaven the way news moves through small places, faster and less accurately than anyone intends. Within 3 weeks of Calvin's conversation with Russell, half the township had a version of the story. Most versions were wrong in the details, but correct in the tone. A mill worker who knew nothing about orchards had persuaded an old man to delay a land sale in order to plant apple trees, that nobody grew anymore, because nobody grew them anymore, for reasons that should have been obvious to anyone who thought about it for 30 seconds. The loudest of the skeptics was a man named Douglas Fenn. Douglas Fenn was 61 years old, a third-generation apple grower whose family had farmed the next concession over for as long as anyone in the township could remember. He was heavyset, with a broad red face and cropped-up silver hair, the kind of man who wore the same canvas jacket from September through May and considered this a sign of character. He was not malicious. He was certain, and certainty, in Douglas Fenn's case, had been reinforced by decades of moderate success that had never once required him to rethink his assumptions. When Douglas heard what Calvin was planning, he stopped by the orchard one Saturday morning in November, ostensibly to return a soil auger he had borrowed from Russell 2 seasons earlier. Calvin was in the equipment shed reorganizing the spray records when Douglas appeared in the doorway. "Heard you're putting in heirlooms," Douglas said. Calvin straightened up. "Heritage varieties." "Some of them, yes." Douglas looked around the shed with the expression of a man reassessing a situation he had already assessed. "Northern Spy? Cox? Those old ones?" "Some. Also some of the mid-century selections that got dropped when the industry went to Gala and Honeycrisp." Douglas made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "There's a reason nobody grows those anymore." "There are a few reasons," Calvin said. "Some of them are still good reasons. Some of them were good reasons 40 years ago and haven't been examined since." The older farmer shook his head slowly, the gesture of a man who had seen younger men make expensive mistakes and had learned the patience to watch them happen. "Russell's land is good land," he said. "Don't burn it up on an experiment." Calvin thanked him for returning the auger. That afternoon he drove to Owen Sound and spent 3 hours at the library pulling agricultural extension reports going back to the 1970s. He had already ordered 4 boxes of certified trees through a heritage nursery in Prince Edward County. Tolman Sweet, Wealthy, Snow, Alexander, and 2 selections of a cider variety called Foxwhelp that a researcher at the University of Guelph had been quietly recommending for Grey County's climate conditions for nearly a decade without the industry paying much attention. He had also been corresponding by email with a retired horticulturalist named Edmund Pruitt, who had spent 30 years studying orchard floor ecology and had some very specific opinions about grass management that Calvin intended to implement, regardless of how it looked to the people driving past on the county road. Russell Whitmore did not understand all of what Calvin proposed, but when Calvin sat with him at the kitchen table and explained it slowly and without condescension, Russell listened. He was a man who had spent his life paying attention to things. He recognized that quality in others. "You'll let the grass come up between the rows," Russell said, not as a question. "Yes, people will say the place has gone to weeds. They will." Russell was quiet. He looked down at his hands, which still showed the calluses of 40 years of pruning work. "My father planted the original block in 1951, he said. Gallus weren't even a commercial variety yet. He chose those old trees because he knew the land, and he knew the land would hold them." He looked up at Calvin. "You think the land still remembers?" Calvin thought about that. "I think it never forgot," he said. "I think we just stopped asking it the right questions." Russell did not call the buyer in Barrie that week, or the week after. Spring arrived late to Gray County, which it usually did. The frost stayed in the ground until the third week of April, and even after it lifted, the mornings held a damp chill that kept anyone sensible in their barns until 9 o'clock. Calvin was not always sensible. He was in the orchard by 6 most mornings, walking rows, kneeling to press fingers into the soil, recording what he found in a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket. The carrotage trees went into the ground in the third week of May. 64 of them, in the 2 blocks that had suffered the worst fire blight damage and been cleared the previous autumn. Calvin planted them himself over 4 days, with Russell watching from the lane, wrapped in a heavy coat despite the warm afternoon sun, his hands in his pockets and his eyes on every movement. The response from the township was swift and unanimous in its dismissal. "Those trees won't see fruit for 3 years minimum," Douglas Fenn told anyone who would listen. And even then, what's he going to sell them for? To who? This was a fair question. Calvin knew it was a fair question. He had asked it himself many times, in the small houses at the end of the lane at 10 o'clock at night with the accounts open in front of him, and Diane reading beside him on the couch and the weight of the whole project sitting on his chest. The heritage market was real but thin. The cider industry was growing in Ontario, but slowly. The premium grocery channel was unpredictable. There were no guarantees. What Calvin had was a set of soil readings he had been taking since November, a research paper from Guelph he had read 6 times, and the particular kind of certainty that does not announce itself loudly. He also had Edmund Pruitt. Edmund Pruitt was 67 years old, recently retired from a 40-year career with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture. He was slight and wiry, with a full gray beard and bright, restless eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that he was constantly pushing back up his nose. He drove up from Guelph on a Saturday in June, introduced himself to Russell with a firm handshake and a genuine curiosity about the old tree records, and spent most of the day on his knees in various parts of the orchard, with a hand lens and a collection of small sample jars. Over dinner that evening, Edmund said something that Calvin had suspected but hadn't heard stated plainly before. "The problem with this orchard is not the trees," Edmund said. "The problem is the floor. 40 years of clean tillage and herbicide strips have killed the mycorrhizal networks in the top 30 centimeters. The trees aren't sick, they're isolated. They've lost their connections." Russell stared at him. "The grass," he said slowly. "I used to let some of it go years back. My father always kept a rougher floor than most." Edmund nodded. "Your father may have understood something intuitively that the industry spent 60 years learning to ignore." That night, after Edmund left and Russell had gone to bed, Calvin sat on the porch step, with a cup of tea gone cold in his hands, and looked at the dark shapes of the orchard rows against the summer sky. Somewhere in the grass between the trees, things were beginning to happen that no one could see. He had no way to prove that yet. He had only the data he was collecting and the slow, accumulating evidence of his own attention. The summer was hard in different ways than Calvin had expected. The trees were fine. The heritage varieties settled into the ground with a steadiness that surprised even Edmund when he returned in August. The grass grew as intended, and Calvin left it. The orchard floor, which had been bare brown dirt in May, was thick and green by July, threaded through with clover and plantain and the first reappearance of species Edmund had identified in the soil seed bank from the original assessments. It looked, to most people driving the county road, like neglect. Douglas Fenn said as much at the Millhaven Co-op one Thursday morning in August to a small audience of men waiting for their feed orders. "I went past Whitmore's yesterday," he said. "Grass is up to the lower branches on some of those old trees. I've seen abandoned places kept up better." A few men chuckled. One of them was Calvin's neighbor, a retired dairy farmer named Stewart, who had known Russell Whitmore for 30 years and felt some obligation to mild defense. "Calvin seems to know what he's doing," Stewart offered. "Knowing what you're doing and doing something sensible aren't the same thing," Douglas said. Calvin was not there. He was in the orchard, kneeling in the grass with his notebook, recording the earthworm count in a 1-foot soil core from the northeast block. The number was higher than it had been in May, significantly higher. He wrote it down and moved to the next site. The following spring brought a drought, not a catastrophic drought. Gray County rarely suffered those, but a dry spring, the driest in 11 years, according to the weather station at Meaford. The rain that normally soaked the county through April and early May arrived in brief, scattered events that moistened the surface and evaporated before anything deeper could drink. By June, neighboring operations were already moving irrigation equipment into their orchards. Hay prices edged upward. Conversations at the co-op turned, as they always did in dry years, to water. Calvin walked his orchard every morning and watched what happened. What happened was not what he expected in its specifics, though it matched what Edmund had told him was theoretically possible. The heritage block held moisture longer than the adjacent rows. The grass-floored sections recovered between rain events in ways the cleaner-kept areas did not. When Calvin pushed a soil probe into the northeast block, the first section where the grass management had been established, it went in easier than it had any right to, drawing moisture from layers that the clay-heavy soil of neighboring properties had never accessed. One morning in late June, he noticed Douglas Fenn's truck parked at the end of the lane. The older farmer sat behind the wheel looking toward the orchard, not in a mocking way, just looking. Calvin raised a hand. Douglas gave a slow nod and drove on. A week later, a woman named Margaret Hollis stopped by. Margaret Hollis was 44 years old, with short, practical dark hair and the kind of focused attention that made people feel immediately assessed. She wrote for an agricultural publication based in Guelph that went to about 8,000 Ontario farm operators. She had heard about the Whitmore orchard from Edmund Pruitt, who had heard about it from someone at the university, which was how these things traveled in the world of small agricultural reform. She spent 2 days on the property. She asked careful questions. She photographed the soil profiles that Calvin excavated for her. She was politely skeptical and, by the end of the second day, less politely interested. The article ran in September. It was measured in its claims. Margaret Hollis was not the kind of writer who overstated, but the headline used the word remarkable, and in the agricultural extension world, remarkable sent people looking. 3 weeks after the article ran, a soil health specialist from the Ministry of Agriculture drove up from Toronto to have a look. Her name was Dr. Anne Forsyth. She was 50 years old, with silver-streaked hair cut short and hazel eyes that moved constantly, cataloging. She had spent 2 decades studying orchard floor ecology across southern Ontario and had seen enough well-intentioned restoration projects fail that she had developed a reflexive caution about early-stage results. She arrived on a Tuesday morning carrying her own sampling equipment and a polite but non-committal expression. Calvin showed her everything, the soil records going back to November of the first year, the mycorrhizal assessments Edmund had done, the moisture retention data through the drought spring. The earthworm counts at 12 monitoring sites throughout the orchard. The recovery of the heritage tree block and the initial fruit set on the oldest trees, small, irregular, nothing you'd sell to a grocery chain, but present and healthy. Anne Forsyth spent 2 days with those records. On the second afternoon, she stood in the northeast block with a soil core in her hand, turning it slowly and examining it in the flat September light. "This is not what I expected to see at this stage," she said. Calvin waited. She looked up at him. "What made you confident enough to let the grass go in the first year? Most operators in your situation would have kept conventional floor management while they figured out if the heritage varieties would establish." Calvin thought about it. "I wasn't confident," he said. "I was just more afraid of losing another year to the wrong system than of being wrong about the new one." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a specific kind of courage," she said. The provincial assessment report was completed in November. It didn't make front-page news. Agricultural reports rarely do. But it circulated through the ministry's extension network, and within a few weeks, Calvin had received 3 phone calls from other Grey County operators asking if they could visit the orchard in the spring. One of them, he noted with a complicated feeling, was Douglas Fenn. The conversation with Douglas happened on a Saturday afternoon in November, in the same equipment shed where they had first spoken about the heritage plan 2 years earlier. The trees were dormant now, the orchard floor flattened by the first frosts, but still holding the underlying structure that all the summer's work had built. Douglas came alone, which somehow made the conversation feel more serious. He stood for a while looking at the heritage block through the shed's open door. The trees were small but even. They had the look of things that intended to stay. "I've been doing some reading," Douglas said finally. He said it with the particular tone of a man who considers reading about farming to be a different and lesser thing than farming itself, but who has done it anyway. Calvin said nothing. The floor management piece. Douglas cleared his throat. "I had a section in the east block go to rough grass a few summers back. Thought it was a problem. Ended up being my best holding section through that dry spell." Calvin nodded. Douglas was quiet for a longer moment. Then, "What would you change if you were starting over on my place?" The question hung in the cold air of the shed. Calvin thought about the 2 years of sideways looks and co-op commentary, and the very specific quality of being wrong in public in a place where everyone knows you. He thought about his father-in-law standing at the end of the lane in his coat, watching every tree go in the ground. He thought about something Russell had said to him once, early on, when the doubt was loudest. People learn the land on their own schedule. You can't push it and you can't teach it. You can only show them. "You'd start with the soil," Calvin said. "Before the trees, before the varieties, before any of it. Find out what's living down there. Find out what's been lost. Then give it back what it needs to make its own connections." Douglas Fenn was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the dormant trees. "I spent 30 years doing it the way my father did it," he said, "which is how his father did it." "That's not nothing," Calvin said. "No." Douglas put his hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket. "But maybe it's not everything either." He left shortly after. Calvin stood in the doorway of the shed and watched the pickup turn onto the county road and disappear. That evening, at the kitchen table in the small house, Russell Whitmore sat across from Calvin and Diane with a cup of tea between his hands. The old man had changed over the 2 years. Not dramatically. Age had been working in him long before any of this began, but there was a quality to the change that was harder to name. The worry around his eyes had settled into something quieter. He moved through the orchard now with a different kind of authority, stopping to examine things, asking Edmund's questions with his own words. "There was a man from the Heritage Nursery in Prince Edward County who called today," Russell said. "Wants to know if we'd be interested in trialing 2 more varieties. something from the Annapolis Valley that they've been evaluating for a decade. Diane looked at her father. "What did you tell him?" Russell smiled. It was a small and unhurried smile, the smile of a man who has made peace with a very long argument. "I told him to call back in the spring," he said. "We'll be here." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the November wind moved through the dormant apple rows, the same wind that moved through everything in this part of the country, indifferent to what had happened and what was planned and what might yet take hold. Russell looked at his son-in-law. "You know," he said, "when you first came to me with this plan, I thought you were asking the land to do something it couldn't do." Calvin said nothing. "I was wrong about what it couldn't do," Russell said. "And I was wrong about what you were asking." "What was I asking?" Calvin said. The old man thought for a moment. "You were asking it to remember what it already knew." Later, when Russell had gone to bed and Diane was reading on the couch, Calvin put on his coat and went outside. The night was clear and very cold. The orchard lay dark and still below the ridge, 60 acres of sleeping trees and living ground, roots going down into soil that had spent 2 years relearning how to hold things. An independent appraisal the previous month had put the property's value, on the basis of its soil health recovery, its heritage variety inventory, and its positioning for the growing Ontario cider and specialty fruit market, 38% above the offer that had almost sent it to a subdivision in Barrie. The buyer from Barrie had not called back. There was nothing left to call about. Calvin stood at the orchard's edge and breathed the cold air. He was not the kind of man who made speeches, even to himself. He did not feel triumphant. He felt something quieter and more durable than triumph, the particular satisfaction of a person who has trusted a slow thing long enough to see it arrive. The stars above the escarpment were very clear. Somewhere in the dark ground below his boots, mycorrhizal threads were carrying messages between root systems that had not spoken to each other in decades. The land did not know it had almost been sold. It only knew what it had always known, that given enough patience and enough quiet and enough of the right kind of attention, it knew how to find its way back. That had been true before any fence was built here. It would be true long after every fence was gone. Calvin stood there a while longer. Then he went inside and turned off the light and let the orchard sleep. If this story stayed with you, we'd love to know. Leave a comment sharing one time in your life when patience led you somewhere you didn't expect. If you found something here worth holding on to, please like this video, subscribe to the Quiet Hour Tales, and share it with someone who might need a quiet moment today. God bless you and everyone you're holding close this season.